Awesome. So, in my neighborhood of Eastlake, which is in District 4, we actually have the highest concentration of houseboats in the city.
Well, floating houses.
Floating houses. Is that what they're...
Okay, so if it looks like a house, like it's just a big square house that's kind of on a dock, it's actually a floating house.
A floating house.
Now,
okay.
Now, not to be pedantic, but I do live on a boat.
Yeah, so I want to be politically correct with it.
There are houseboats too. Houseboats, there are some of those. They're like almost more like boats. They're like a weird little house on top of a boat shape.
Right. But that's not what we're talking about.
There's some of those in there too.
Okay.
In the Eastlake Docks.
But no, it's floating houses, definitely. That's what I meant. Anyway, so we have the highest concentration of floating houses. In the 1970s, there was a semi-famous Eastlake resident named Terry Pettis, who was a communist. He actually founded the Pacific Northwest Newspaper Guild. And he organized all of the residents of the floating houses to tax themselves to pay for cleanup of the lake.
Damn.
And it's something that, Seattle residents have a long tradition of taxing their property to pay for shit because we don't have
other mechanisms.
The political will necessarily to tax the rich and the uber rich.
Yeah.
But I feel, as strange as it seems to say, in touch with my Northwest communist roots by being on this boat, and I'm hoping that you're taxing yourself to pay for these Bloody Marys that we're drinking.
Yes.
Sucks. Welcome back to Seattle Sucks. It's a whole new year. Greg keeps saying it's a whole new season. So
season 2.
This is the next season, apparently, of Seattle Sucks. So welcome to it. As well, we're joined with a very special guest. But before we introduce that guest, I think Greg had something to say about you giving us some money.
Yeah. Speaking of the Seattle Sucks Fund, we've just launched a Patreon.
That just is a...
Anyway, we're now taking more seriously the idea of begging people for money. Because it seems like leaving money on the table otherwise. Also, I'm mostly unemployed and kind of have nothing going on except this. So you can find our Patreon. We'll link to it.
Yeah.
That will help us continue to keep doing this and buying better and better liquor for guests.
Mm-hmm.
And so every little bit helps.
Yeah.
And, like we said last time, if there is enough interest shown, maybe we'll consider premium content. But you have to make the first move.
All right. Well, yeah, thanks for that, Greg. So we're joined by the incredible Shaun Scott. So if you're not aware of Shaun, he's an author of a book, Millennials and the Moments That Made Us. He was a journalist at City Arts. He's an activist. He is a member of DSA, and he happens to be running for City Council in District 4. So welcome to the show. We're really so glad to have you here.
Thank you so much.
We've been trying to make this happen for a long time.
Yeah.
And your star keeps rising as ours maybe putters behind. Not quite the same rate.
Well, you shamed me on Twitter for...
That was Greg.
That was very well played. Guilt just isn't... Guilt isn't only for liberals, it turns out. There's such a thing as socialist guilt. When you shame me on Twitter for not following up on an appointment that we had to meet and talk, it's very effective.
That's interesting. No, that was a big revelation for me. I don't know if I buy your thesis. One of my recurring theses on this show is that there is no socialist guilt. So that is something we may have to parse it.
We can explore that
time.
Well, so really what you don't know about Greg is Greg does not have guilt. That's
what we're getting at.
It's not about being
all right.
socialist per se, but
as usual, I tend to sort of project my own psyche onto like the
Everything.
structure,
Right.
you know,
Sure.
which I'm totally comfortable doing, and is really why I have a podcast.
Right.
Yeah, thank you for coming on the show. As we said, you're running for City Council in District 4, which is northeast Seattle, which includes U District,
Right.
Laurelhurst, is that right?
Ravenna,
Ravenna, Maple Leaf,
Roosevelt.
Eastlake.
Yeah.
And I think one big thing we wanted to talk to you about is your recent sort of policy paper that you put out on Medium, and I think you maybe put it out on my birthday, on the solstice.
Oh, happy birthday.
21st
Right.
of December. So we just wanted to talk you through that because, I mean, I don't want to spoil anything, but it was very unique for me to see, so I'd love to hear the thinking behind it and the history.
Right. Well, the policy rollout, it rolled out on your birthday, on the solstice, because that's a time of year, I think, symbolically, where you hear a lot of people talking about women and LGBTQIA plus folks in particular talking about feeling unsafe when it's as dark as it is on streets that are as poorly lit as many of Seattle's streets are. And so rolling out a policy platform that had to do with how do we make Seattle an actually anti-sexist, anti-homophobic city was an opportunity that we had been thinking about for a while. And so, you know, Greg, you were riffing a little bit about sort of the lack of the voices of women and LGBTQIA folks generally. I think in urban planning, that's something that you see a lot, which is odd because Jane Jacobs is like the most influential urban planner ever. And so it's unfortunate that, you know, sort of subsequently a lot of the things that she had to say about how cities were supposed to be outlaid have really not been implemented so much by male leadership. And so, you know, central to the Jacobsian vision is this idea that increased density, more people having their eyes on the street, as she put it, housing options of all kinds of sort of income tiers, especially for working people, means that your streets are going to be safer. There's going to be more street activity, a better sense of people having ownership of their neighborhoods and the public space in it. And so that is really kind of the foundation of my candidacy ultimately, is having a housing first, housing now, deeply affordable housing approach. But having that focus means that we're going to see peripheral, or I don't mean to say peripheral, but other related benefits in other walks of civic life. For instance, suddenly when people are feeling safer as a matter of having more street activity, you have less of a need for carceral solutions and pushing for hundreds, more police officers on the street. When you're going in the direction of housing now, housing first, women and LGBTQI plus folks who are in abusive relationships, for example, will be more likely to leave those because they're not depending on them for the financial stability that might come with them. And so housing forms the core. Housing is sort of, as it relates to the right that the citizens of Seattle have to the city, forms the core of my platform. But it's not a gender-blind or a race-blind urbanist vision. It's one that says that actually having more public space, having more civic investment in housing means that we're going to have the quality of life for minorities, for women, for sexual minorities is going to be greater in the end.
That's one thing that I found uniquely interesting, is in that piece you are able to talk about safety on the street, which historically has been like very much like a reactionary sort of talking point, in that because, as you say, it's usually directed at the carceral solution, the police state, more cops, better armed cops, more prisons, like that's the solution to all this. So I think that's what's so unique about like a growing left is an ability to actually say something new about and really talk about the same, what are real issues, but talk about them in different ways. So I'd like to hear more about like how we can get to a place where we need less cops, where we don't feel the need for the carceral state or an argument that can actually make the idea of like police abolition like seem real. You know?
Well, I think that the way to think about this is in sort of the context of a 35-year-long war on drugs going all the way back to 1982, where, you know, the Reagan administration and a lot of prison profiteers realized that there was a lot of business, military contractors who were in business with local police departments. Among them, these big institutional forces realized that there was actually a lot of money and political capital to be made off of the over-criminalization of ills like drug abuse and street crime. A half generation prior, we actually saw our greatest steps forward as a country with respect to stemming drug abuse, and it's a problem that correlates very, very strongly to the houseless population. It's why I'm bringing it up in this context. But we saw our greatest steps forward on that issue when we treated drug abuse with empathy as something that needed treatment as opposed to something that needed punishment.
Yeah.
And so methadone clinics that opened in the 1970s, we have not gotten back to a point where we were more successful than we were at that point in fighting the so-called war on drugs. So I think locally, the decisions that we make are being made in the context of that broad federal sort of tectonic context. And so, for example, one of the things that we're going to get ready to talk about is safe consumption sites locally. I mean, that is the most local, hyper-local sort of equivalent to this broader federal trend that we see. And it has to do, again, with realizing that people need to be thinking in more critical ways about the attitudes that we have towards certain social ills. And there have been studies that have been done that show that, you know, people's capacity for empathy shuts off at a certain point in time when they're confronted with images of homelessness and drug abuse. But I think that plays to our worst political instincts, and I think it also leads to worser policy outcomes. There has been study after study that has been done that's shown that we're actually, for all of us, and no person is happy about drug abuse. No person is happy to have to, you know, step over homeless folks, you know, in the morning, you know, to get to work. Nobody's happy about those things, not the least of which are houseless neighbors. And so I think we want to get to a point where that notion of empathy that all of us are able to exercise in our personal lives is something that is sort of writ large in a civic sense.
These arguments combat, like, again, this much larger sort of right-wing idea that the war on drugs and the fear of drugs and addiction, on street crime, all these things have been used to increase the power of, like, a police state, of a paramilitary or militarized police state that incarcerates more people than anyone possibly in the history of the planet.
Right.
We've been doing this for not quite a year. Homelessness issue in this city and everything that has to do with that has been a big part of our beat, and it's been like kind of chilling, really chilling, to read the ways and see the ways, talk about the ways where somehow, like, you can almost get your head around the idea of street crime and drug addiction, if you're a total asshole, thinking like that the answer is like jackbooted thugs with badges, you know, and throwing tons of people in prison, where really those are used to increase that state, to put the police state, also just very specifically, I think, to put a lot of black people in jail.
Right.
But in this city, there is an attitude, somehow that is... actually homelessness is being put right alongside those things of crime and drugs as if it's like an ill in itself. That the people on the street are a social ill that needs to be cleaned up somehow, and the obvious solution to a lot of people is, again, more cops cleaning them up.
Exactly.
And it's just like been like a really nauseating and disturbing thing to hear that, and it like really talked about very openly in this city, connecting all those things.
Right. It is very, very unfortunate. I mean, Seattle has sort of a history of this carceral sort of law and order approach to populations that are stigmatized and marginalized. I mean, it was Seattle that in the late 1880s had federal troops come up here to execute the expulsion of our Chinese population. And that happened in February of, I believe it was 1883, and the troops just kind of hung around until June or July. because of the traffic that they provided to local restaurants and saloons. It was actually a business boon to have this kind of law and order, sort of apparatus here. And so we've been dealing with that as a city for as long as we've been a city. And the thing about it is that it just doesn't work. You can make all the moral arguments in the world, of which there are many, foremost among them being, racism is bad. I don't know about you guys, but that's just kind of the read I'm starting to get. You ever notice that it might be...
that's starting to form.
I don't know. I'm coming around.
Jury's
to
still
that.
out. Right. Well, I think that there's a case to be made, to say the least. But aside from the moral arguments, it's also the policy arguments that just doesn't lead to good outcomes for anybody. No. I think about the Ravenna Woods encampment, homeless encampment that is located in my district. I attended the last sweep of that encampment, or a sweep of that encampment. It may have been swept another time since, but I attended a sweep of that encampment that took place in April of this year. And my understanding is that it had already been swept multiple times, and the houseless folks just end up rematriculating right back to that same location. Yeah. It is very reminiscent of stories that we heard about Hoovervilles that sprung up in the middle of the Great Depression. And in fact, the University of Washington's Civil Rights and Labor History Project, which has done some work on sort of historicizing the Great Depression in Washington State, they talk about the same refrain of just like you sweep the encampment, it just gets reestablished at a later point. And so we're dealing with all of those lessons now, and I think it's gonna have to take getting to a point where we realize that it's not homeless people that are the problem. It's homelessness as in and of itself as a social ill that is created by a lot of structural forces that are going to make the problem, which is not the people, go away.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think, like you're describing, the way that the drug war and the quote war on crime somehow gets away with just expanding the police state without actually affecting any positive solution, which is there's pieces of theater that they can do just constantly, endlessly, that shows, look, we're doing something. Progress. So like whether that's a drug bust by the DEA or something as sort of petty and inhumane as a encampment sweep here in Seattle, it's sort of red meat. It's just they're saying, look, we got a bunch of calls from people, assholes with like houses in Ravenna that there's this homeless menace in the woods, and this is us performing that we are using the tools we have specified, the police state, to do something about it.
And costing the city in the process $10 million a year on this ineffective policy measure. Sheik Hawkins Jr., Day Sheik Kim Hawkins Jr.
We've had him on, actually.
He's great, has done some great reporting about this and talked about how it's just a waste of money. I want to make sure to clarify, I attended the Ravenna Woods sweep not as a cop, as a protester. I don't know if that was clear I feel like I left a qualifier out there.
I showed up with my buddies. I brought the donuts and coffee that morning.
Oh my god.
Yeah.
Are you dressed up like one of those Proud Boys in like makeshift medieval armor?
I had the polo and everything. The black polo with the yellow collar. I was a good boy.
Well,
it brings out
I mean, exactly like you're saying, it feels like the conversation is all about aesthetics, and that it's an eyesore really more than anything. And we've talked about this on the show a lot, and that nothing is being done to address the systemic issues that cause the conditions that create all of these problems and scare quotes that we have in Seattle.
Right.
And so one thing sort of related to housing, I guess, is I think the Neighborhoods for All report came out maybe late November. Is that right? How does that intersect at all with this? Is it fair to call it feminist urbanism? How do those two play together, or do they?
Greatly. I mean, the Neighborhoods for All report, to summarize for the listeners, it was a report that was released by the Seattle Planning Commission, one of the city's own bureaus, that revealed in scare quotes what many housing activists have been talking about for decades now, which is that single-family home zoning effectively creates a situation in cities like Seattle where apartments are effectively illegal in upwards of 2/3 of the city's landmass. These neighborhoods are zoned in such a way that the only kinds of property that you can place on them are single-family homes, not apartments, not duplexes, not condos, nothing of that sort. And that style of zoning, that residential configuration has deep, deep roots in residential segregation, in the sense that many of the homes that were placed in this zoning, in these seas of single-family zoning, were at one point in time racially restrictive. And it has to do with the ways that big banks and big capitals sort of cater to the prejudices of the 20th century, many of which, I'd argue most of which still exist to this day. Homeowners being afraid that if you had renters, poor people, people of color, their property values would sink. And so what we have effectively is a bunch of apartment bans throughout Seattle. And when we talk about affordable housing, a lot of the conversation is frankly academic in the sense that there's only so much of the city's surface area where we can actually put affordable housing or dense housing of any kind, so that when you want to have a conversation about how to increase street activity, about how to have denser neighborhoods, more affordable neighborhoods, the area in which we can actually put any of those kinds of neighborhoods is severely limited as a result of this style of zoning, which the Planning Commission in the Neighborhood for All report called attention to. My campaign, in the days following the release of that report, we rolled out our own enthusiastic endorsement of the findings of the Planning Commission, because, I thought it was important to, as somebody who, I was a student filmmaker when I was at the University of Washington and worked with the Civil Rights and Labor History Project, where they had actually done a lot of the first work to track sort of the roots of these single-family neighborhoods like Ravenna, Laurelhurst, etc.
Yeah.
And the roots that had in racial segregation in Seattle in the early 20th century. And so this has always been something that I've, have felt really, really passionate about undoing and addressing at the city level. And we're not the only city that recognizes this to be a problem. Minneapolis has recently, to an extent, abolished single-family zoning. But I think it's important to make sure that that's coupled with a real commitment to deep affordable housing, so that we're not just talking about opening up more of the city to large capitalist conglomerates, but we're actually creating more space in the city for people to have ownership of the city.
And that's definitely something I'm hoping we'll touch on later when we talk about that City Journal piece. About the supply of housing.
Right.
But I've got something we can go into. Is there anything else you want to touch on that we're thinking about?
Yeah, because I mean, it wasn't all housing. You had a lot of points. You had removing a tax on any products related to menstruation.
Exactly.
You had broader support for pronoun usage on city forums. Were there any other things that you'd like to highlight specifically?
Well, in that the Seattle is an anti-sexist city policy rollout, we also tried to talk about reviving a universal basic income pilot that the city actually had for a decade. From 1971 to 1982, we paid out about $24,000, the modern equivalent of $24,000 a year, to working families. A study that was done subsequent to the expiration of that program in 1982 showed that some of the greatest beneficiaries of that basic income pilot were, number one, students and students in the university district area. And number two, women that were stuck in bad relationships and wanted to get a divorce but couldn't do it because they were relying on male breadwinner models, which were not, up to that point, the sexual revolution notwithstanding, extinct. As we got into the 1980s. So I think that that's something else that I would like to think about, and making that actually specific to working mothers, and having that the revenue solution about where that would actually come from is a question that we have to address. I have advanced the idea of looking for an eco-tax on large polluters in the region, so that's a potential revenue source that we can use to fund such a program. And I think addressing it, programs like these, entitlement programs like these at the municipal level, making them themed specifically for vulnerable populations is really going to be the way to go, because history has sort of shown, both at the local and the national levels, that when you have broad entitlement programs that are sort of advanced as universal in nature, there's a certain danger that they don't address the people that they really need to be addressing the most. And so actually having those programs, something like a basic income pilot, go towards working moms in particular, I think is something that if I ruled the world, or if I was a city councilman, I'd be pushing for that.
Yeah, as a parent, I when I read that, that definitely really resonated with me because until you have a child, you don't realize how much work they are. They're an incredible amount of work, and I can't tell you how many times I've said I don't know what a single parent would do, especially if you're working. I mean, it's just impossible. So a solution like this to help those people in that situation would be fantastic. And I think I remember you saying that potentially we could pay for it by, you called it, I believe, a pink tax, by taxing any company, big businesses that were contributing towards the pay gap.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm all for that. That sounds great.
Me too.
Let's Sounds like another hard tax fight, which I'm all in for. I think, like...
Yeah, we need to pay more money.
I mean, this is why, okay, so you're a Democratic Socialist.
Right.
You've got these big dreams and these... and this nutty idea of, taxing the people who are benefiting most from our society. I
mean, social equity. Who does that?
I don't know, man. Well, not this city. Not yet. I mean, we live. Of course, something we covered a lot on this podcast is the sort of thrilling, bizarre, and ultimately demoralizing fight over the head tax.
Right.
My take on it, anyway, is like I'd rather fight for that stuff and lose and advance the conversation over and over and over again. I think that's something that's why we need a more active left.
Right.
Is to be willing to argue from an ideological position of what's right and what's needed and be willing to lose until you win. But that goes to, like, this question of, like, well, so for example, Shaun Scott, we have a socialist on the city council.
We sure do.
The 7 district seats are up it's November 5th of this year, 2019. So it's a ways out. But her one challenger so far, I think, what's his name? Beto
O'Rourke.
Beto O'Rourke has moved to the Central District. Beto Yars.
I feel my calves cramping.
He's offered his sort of basic critique that he's offered is, it's pretty thin, but it's like Sawant hasn't focused on issues local to the third, that she's concerned with these larger issues. I think the first thing to say with that is, like, meet the left, asshole. Like, it's fucking structural, get used to it.
Beto might want to move to District 3 before he starts running his mouth about people not focusing on District 3. I think that's, it's kind of a low hurdle that he seemed to have tripped over in his announcement. He hadn't yet actually lived in the district that he was purporting to represent. So, funny on him to be accusing anybody else of ignoring the hyper-local issues.
Right.
I mean, I suppose when you have the largest corporation in the world and the richest individual in the history of the world living in your city, I don't think it's too much to ask that you pay attention to some of these large structural forces. But if Beto thinks otherwise, I think it's going to be on him to make that case in the course of the election.
Yeah, well, I think people will make that case. And, I mean, to that point, this year, this last year, 2018, I think was like a year where what sucks about Seattle, it's not only the year we started this podcast, but it's like the year that everything that sucks about Seattle went national. Like, first we had this, like,
really
again, the head tax fight, which just was such a bald and, like, galvanizing example of everything that's sort of wrong with and sort of weak and lame about sort of Lib Dem local governance, about, like, just being totally in the pocket and totally under the leverage of big business. And, I mean, we saw with the biggest company in the world, the richest man, just sort of stomp on the political process here, and that story went national during the same year that same company was perpetrating a massive con on the entire country that, again, also perfectly illustrated what is, like, an ongoing problem of this race to the bottom of cities and states, like, selling their souls to these corporations for the myth, for those mythical jobs.
Gotta get those jobs.
And just this week, in the New York Times, which Seattle Times picked up, and then Gene Balk wrote a response in the Seattle Times about, let's see, what's the New York Times headline is, may your city never become San Francisco, New York, or Seattle. And Gene Balk wrote about it in the Seattle Times, and then the great Charles Medidi,
Right.
had a response to Stranger. That the sort of narrative of which is like basically in the New York Times, it's Seattleization is a particularly dire diagnosis. The high housing costs and tech riches there have remade the city with startling speed. And then in the Seattle Times, Gene Balk says, in so many ways, Seattle is an amazing success story. Thriving and economically vibrant, which those are fucking meaningless words, drawing thousands of people from around the country and the world. When you think about the great American cities that have fallen on hard times, that are losing population and dealing with epidemics of violent crime, Seattle seems enviable. Wow. And so, okay, there's a lot of like meaningless signifiers in there, and then again,
and Medede wrote that. Oh my god!
No.
It's like, geez, Medede, that's a far fall, man.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding.
Seriously. And what Modidi pulls out, and I recommend everyone take a look at this. It's called "If You Want Worldly Success, You Must Be Like Seattle," and this is from January 2nd. This is Charles Medidi in The Stranger, or Slog anyway. And what he points out is like this bullshit false dichotomy and this total like limit of options between what the other articles are talking about as these like broken cities like Detroit,
right,
or these growing hyper-capitalist cities like Seattle, where it's like those are your two options, which means and they can't, they're like, well, I don't know what to make of this, because there's all these good things about Seattle that at the end their thesis seems to be, well, you have to take the good with the bad because the only other option is Detroit. And Modidi points out that this is like a ludicrous false dichotomy.
Right.
So he says, my point is the other cities considering Seattle's success and its dangers are not presented with other serious options. They do not exist. In capitalist societies, we have been confined to two cities, Detroit or Seattle. You can't really talk about how to avoid one without falling into the other.
Right.
And to bring it back,
right,
that's why there has to be a structural critique, and that's why, like, you can't talk about. It's not like how can you say that people in the third are not affected by these massive issues?
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, and I localize it to our district as well, where we have a very, very strong union of academic and student employees that are very, very aware of the neoliberal turn that Medede has written about very, very piercingly for years. The fact that we have
years,
as many
incessantly, beautifully.
We have a big population of students and renters as well, people that very, very acutely feel the philosophical shift that we made from treating housing as a social good to treating it as a commodity. And that's something that, we've started to see over the last couple of generations, and it has real material impacts on how we go about leading our lives in District 4. I mean, people having to make the choice between nutrition and textbooks, I think, is a just morally reprehensible state that speaks to sort of these broad shifts. But I think that the Detroit-Seattle dichotomy is interesting because it is founded in a structural reality that is become reified and is no less real as a result, even though it's based on an ideologically extreme position, which is that cities can't or shouldn't use own source revenues to fund the things that they need to take care of citizens in them.
Yeah.
And that if you do anything to really turn the heat up on the big businesses that you foster, provide lucrative contracts to, government kickbacks to, those same corporations are going to be legitimated and leaving. When you have an arrangement like that is, as I said, an extreme position philosophically, but has been made real by policy choices over the decades, you have a situation where it can feel that way, even if that doesn't have to be the reality. And here, I think, Mark Fisher's capitalist realism is a really formative way of thinking about these issues, was for me, because it shows you that there is an alternative, despite what Margaret Thatcher opined. There is an alternative to this state of affairs, and the alternative is solidarity. It's cities, major cities, at the regional level, at the national level, realizing that we're all playing the same game and that we'll continue to lose it as long as we're not in solidarity with one another. And internal solidarity as well, in the sense that people within cities and blocks of populations in the city need to realize that we have the ability to have a say-so over how our government functions with respect to these large corporations that take and take and take from the city but don't want to give back.
Yeah, I think on the city and state level anyway, I think this is different and way more complicated on the national level, but on the city and state level, to quote Margaret Thatcher again, yeah, you are going to have to spend other people's money.
Right.
And good. But that's the fight, you know?
And it's important to make the case that that's wealth that we helped to create. Cities like Seattle that had, in the 1950s and 60s, a strong military presence, in particular, were responsible for incubating the technology that became the internet, that then led into sort of the tech boom that we saw in the 1990s. Major corporations like Boeing. Boeing in particular actually received the largest package of corporate welfare in 2014, some $8 or $9 billion, a welfare package that was the size of the city of Seattle's entire budget.
That's after decades of building that company on war profiteering.
Right, and they made the decision to just leave anyway, right? To relocate their corporate headquarters or a headquarters anyway.
Good thing we learned that lesson.
Right, exactly. And so that's wealth that we helped create, and I think in the same way that labor is entitled to everything that it creates, I think civic wealth and civic engineering is entitled to everything that it creates. And so it's about building the political will for that position and realizing that it is a deeply controversial one, only because we've seen and gone for so long without advancing it. But I think we're starting to turn a corner here.
Yeah, that might be a good place to take a darker turn. We've debated the sanity of even going down this road, but to hear a bit from this is something we try to do, is hear the other side. We try to bring in all voices and be fair and balanced on this show. And this week we were treated to an article in City Journal, republished in the New York Post. Looks like, if I'm reading this correctly, on the 27th. Of December. This is from friend of the show, friend of Seattle, Christopher Rufo, who mysteriously was for like an hour and a half running for city council against Michael Bryan.
Yeah.
And this is called Seattle Under Siege. So just like,
is this a new Death Wish?
Yeah, but this is the what's his name from Under Siege?
Oh, Seagal?
Yeah. This is a Seattle-based Death Wish. Instead of Bronson, it's Steven Seagal.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's basically it. If you just read between the lines, which is like a lot of what we've covered from Next Door and where else. So I think I told Colin I was almost punching holes in the hull of the boat reading this the other day after he sent it to me. And because it's just so fucking aggravating. Okay, I mean it's fucking dark, man. But this is it's a long piece, and he really sums up like a lot of the attitude in this town, like that exists. I'm not saying it's a majority, but man, it is out there. Yeah. And he is he is vocalizing it pretty thoroughly here. Seattle is under siege. Over the past 5 years, the Emerald City has seen an explosion of homelessness, crime, and addiction. Which, notice, like, that's just a list separated only by commas.
Right.
It's something we've come, this conflation of these things. I mean, I will never get through this, because every sentence I'm just going to trip over, like, oh, god damn it. In its 2017 point-in-time count of the homeless, King County Social Services Agency All Home found 1,643 people sleeping in tents, cars, and emergency shelters. Property crime has risen to a rate 2.5 times higher than Los Angeles's and 4 times higher than New York City's. I'm going to take those statistics as like
that has to
heavily massaged. I mean,
just hearing these words from Rufo, it really brings to mind the Dark Knight movie series, and it makes me wonder why Rufo doesn't just commit to the terminal point of his ideological position, which is to just don the Batman uniform and fight the crime himself. I mean, if it's as terrible as he says it is, and institutions have been doing so little and nothing for so long, and it's simultaneously true that government shouldn't be doing anything to solve these things, then why not just find a Robin, spend, whatever it takes to get a mobile and just go out and just fight it himself. I mean,
wait, is he Batman or is he Bane, though?
I think Bane got a bad
You're
rap.
like, oh, no, I'm Bane.
Christopher Rufo was merely influenced by the dark. I was molded, sculpted by it. You adopted it. It betrays him because it belongs to me.
Oh my god. Cleanup crews pick up tens of thousands of dirty needles from city streets and parks every year. Again, like, conflation of these things as causal or inextricable. We could be we could be looking at these things separately on a structural level and solving all of them.
Very true.
Instead of just vilifying the people suffering most in our society.
Well, it's really interesting to me because the eyesore logic that you were talking about a little bit earlier, sort of, that's a moving target. Sometimes the eyesore has been the populations themselves. Other times the eyesore has been structures that are designed to house those populations and these fights that we saw around public housing in the 50s and 60s. And so the eyesore argument from the vantage point of the white gaze, if you will, which I think Rufo has really, really focused into a real fulcrum point, has always been a moving target, but the problem has always fundamentally been these populations as a reflection of structural failures that we don't have the political will to address. And this is really, I think, I mean, you said that bringing up, Christopher Rufo was a dark turn. I actually think it's probably about the whitest thing that we could be talking about because, there's really nothing more indicative of Seattle's sort of long legacies of white supremacy than sort of these kinds of attitudes towards vulnerable and subaltern populations. And I think Rufo serves a very, very useful sort of role in the equation of city politics, because when you have somebody that is voicing such an extreme position as unapologetically, it really, I think, forces a lot of us to pick which side of that equation we're on. And politicians that appear more proximal to coalitions that are friendly to Christopher Rufo have to be accountable to that. And those of us who are on the other side of the divide have to make sure that we're doing everything that we can to make sure that that's not a vision for Seattle that is going to be realized.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, he goes on. At the same time, according to Puget Sound Business Journal, awesome publication. Everybody should read Puget Sound Business Journal because they've got really great things to say. The Seattle metro area spends more than $1 billion fighting homelessness every year. That's nearly $100,000 for every homeless man, woman, and child in King County.
What is the basis in reality for that?
Who the fuck knows?
Well, and again, like, just taking that on its face, the city's paying a lot of money to essentially round up homeless people. I mean, that's great expense that's not solving any problem. Right. So you can just say we're spending $1 billion, but as we just talked about, you're not spending $1 billion towards solving anything material.
Well, I'll go even farther than that and say, first of all, so this is actually not just this issue, but this is a standard sort of conservative neoliberal trope of we're spending all this money and there's still a problem, so obviously we've wasted all that money. Not the problem is bigger than what we're doing to fight it.
Right.
And so...
Yeah, what if we were spending $1 billion? Is that an argument for... I mean, first of all, I think that statistic is dubious at
totally.
best. I would like to see... sort of where those numbers are pulled from and how that was sort of arrived at. But even if that were the case, what's the point? I mean, what is the point that's being made?
Right.
No money should be spent whatsoever.
Right. We have a problem. People are suffering. So if that's the price tag, what that should tell you is that the system that created that fucking problem is profoundly inefficient and punishing. Like, that is a hole in our social budget here that is being caused by whatever system put all those people out on the street.
Right.
So,
well, if the argument is for scaling back expenses that have to do with addressing houselessness, then I hope that Christopher Rufo would also argue for cutting back on the $10 million a year that are spent on sweeps. I mean, that's part of that budget that he's talking about. That's amount that's resulted in ineffective policy outcomes. And so, I think it's pretty disingenuous, I think, is what it comes down to. The line of reasoning here, and he may or may not hop into the race. I mean, I sort of followed what was going on in all these city council races, because I want to get a sense of who I'm going to be working with when we get in there. And he may or may not hop back into the race. I have sort of the sense that, that's something that could potentially happen. And if not him individually, I think it's, you guys are doing a good job of talking about how representative of a broader philosophical sort of trend and sort of a rightward turn among certain segments of the electorate. But I think that local elections have repeatedly shown that a lot of these sort of regressive forces are not in as much of a position of power or electoral strength as their volume and their vocalness would indicate. So
yeah, I mean that's really important.
Well, in Seattle, what we've seen, again, to bring it back to the employee head tax, really their power is just the money.
Yeah, well, right, like the head tax fight, all they had to say was
just about money.
We might spend a little bit of money on this, so back off.
Right.
It was that simple.
Yeah.
He goes on. Seattle has. I'm skipping ahead a little here. Seattle has long been known as one of America's most liberal locales. But in recent years, the city has marched even further left as socialists, once relegated to the margins, have declared war on the Democratic establishment. Socialist Alternative City Councilwoman Chama Swant claims that the city homelessness crisis is the inevitable result of the Amazon boom. I think that's simplifying, but in a way that she should simplify.
Right.
So, greedy landlords, go figure, and rapidly increasing rents. This is why the resurgent left is so important. Is because when reactionary forces try to argue against sort of mealy-mouthed compromising Lib Dems,
right,
it's easy to cut down bullshit. But and he does this constantly throughout here. When he tries to argue with the socialist position, he just has to state the socialist position as if it's this terrible thing,
so
like on its face.
Right,
but you just read it just like, thank you for making our point. So like that's why that's the political
Cortez.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the political calculus for me. It's like all they can do is make the point.
Right.
I mean, I'm sure they'll come up with new tools, but
right.
As she told Street Roots News, the explosion of the homelessness crisis is a symptom of how deeply dysfunctional capitalism is, and also how much worse living standards have gotten within the last several decades. I mean, this is his pull quote. The capitalists of Amazon. He was quoting Sawant. He goes back. The capitalists of Amazon, Starbucks, and Microsoft, and Boeing, in her Marxian optic, generate enormous wealth for themselves, drive up housing prices, and push the working class toward poverty and despair, and, too often, onto the streets. And it's like,
wasn't that literally what happens?
Yeah.
I'm trying to.
He's like saying that, like, from his like perspective,
just
he's
saying
so
it out
up his
loud,
own
isn't it?
ass. He's like,
right.
Can you believe this?
It's like, well, yeah. I mean,
on the okay, now he has to back up and admit he's smart. He's clever enough to say, on the surface, this argument has its own logic. Watch, he's gonna out logic. He's gonna out logic us here.
I mean, the most sexist thing that you can do, right, is just say, well, she might be a woman, but she's making a lot of sense right now. Thank you for that. She's only a professor of economics and a 2-term councilwoman.
Yeah.
Who the fuck are you to say anything about how much sense it is or is not making? Come on, man.
Yeah.
Advocates point to Zillow and McKinsey studies that show a high correlation between rent hikes and homelessness. An example in Seattle. Wait, between high rent hikes and homelessness. I'm confused. But correlation is not causation. And the survey data paint a remarkably different picture, and here you can smell this coming down the road.
Right.
The survey data. You don't even know what he's talking about.
When I started to smell it was with correlation is not causation.
Yeah.
I studied philosophy at the University of Washington, and anytime any one of these guys dropped that phrase, that's how you knew that it was time to order a shot.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so according to
the drinking game
county's point-in-time study, only 6% of homeless people surveyed cited could not afford rent increase as the precipitating cause of their situation, pointing instead to a wide range of problems: domestic violence, incarceration, mental illness, family conflict, medical conditions, breakups, eviction, addiction, and job loss as bigger factors. Okay, so first of all, a left structural critique is happy to comment
Right.
on how to solve literally every one of those actual problems.
Right.
Secondly, the question is, like, in his mind, this is common, it's like, what went down the day you became homeless?
Right.
Yeah.
Again, like,
yeah.
the moment
Yeah.
you personally, not the decade you held on by your fucking fingernails,
Right.
paying every dollar, paying 50% of your income in rent,
Right.
and just being fucked over by the exorbitant expense of being poor.
What was the
thing
that kicked you into the pit?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
That day.
Right. It's unsavory to say the least. God. Christopher Rufo's killing my buzz right now.
Oh my God.
I got a Seahawks game to watch later. I was feeling pretty good about
Yes,
today.
There's more mezcal here. We can do another
Maybe pour
Bloody
a little
Mary.
bit of that. Yeah, I'll have a little bit of that.
We should have another too.
Thank you very much.
So, having laid out those other causes and correlations,
Right.
which I'm sure you are more than ready to address in your campaign,
Right.
and in a term on the city council, he goes on to say, even in a pricey city like Seattle, oh God, I need to steady myself to read this, most working and middle-class residents respond to economic incentives in logical ways, relocating to less expensive neighborhoods, downsizing to smaller apartments, taking in roommates, moving in with family, or leaving the city altogether. So fuck you, he says to anyone who is struggling to pay their rent.
Right.
Fuck off. Just
Yeah.
fuck off.
It's very, very bad. I mean, one of the reasons why we made our campaign slogan, fighting for the right to the city, a term that, activists in cities have used for decades under the influence of Henry Lefebvre's work. It's because most of the messages that we sort of get from people in positions of power and their cheerleaders and apologists, of which I would count Rufo one, is that if you don't like it, you can simply leave. And it's this logic of separating people out from public land that was initiated in what we saw with and what we know about how Seattle's interacted with its indigenous populations for decades since the inception of the town. It's been replicated in the Chinese expulsion. It's something that we saw with the Japanese American incarceration, gentrification.
It is what
of
gentrification
black communities
is.
exactly. So this logic of or this sort of process of social domination, separating the public out from public land. This is really kind of the latest iteration of that Rufo is sort of articulating here.
Yeah. And when you say it's gentrification, I mean, that's what he's giving a very bald endorsement of gentrification.
Right.
But even the more mainstream sort of liberal view is happy to hand-wring about gentrification as such.
Right.
But ultimately endorses the same logic that says leave it to the free market, and almost more importantly and insidiously embraces the causes of gentrification and sort of, it's like we were talking about with taking the good and the bad, like in the New York Times piece, is like they'll talk about the vibrancy and the economic growth as these are good things without interrogating what that means for, and talk about the city as this entity independent of the people who are living there.
Right.
So that you can talk about the city is doing very well. The city is booming. The city is vibrant and attracting jobs.
Right.
But what is the city other but the fucking people who live there already?
Right. And the relations that they form with one another.
Yeah, and their communities. And so what you're asking, again, it's also, this is just this very modern American accepted idea that just fucking off out of your neighborhood, leaving your communal ties behind, being nomadic and dislocated is what modern 21st century life is.
Right.
And it's time for someone to say, that fucking sucks.
Yeah. And it's not natural either.
No.
And it's not rational, despite what Professor Rufo has to say about it there. I think that it's constructed, it's reified, and as a result, it's something that can be undone, too.
Yeah, you could imagine a different social contract that allowed for, without sort of broadly endorsing this concept, economic growth, that in a just way that benefited the people who are already living in that area.
Right.
Quote, again, to without really interrogating sort of the language of this, to improve a neighborhood without that meaning kicking out like the black families that have lived there for 75 years. You know?
Exactly.
Like,
right.
There is a way to imagine that being possible, but you know, it's currently outside of the scope of what is in people's imaginations.
Right.
God, that makes me fucking mad. I live on a boat. You know what I mean? Like, I'm doing okay. I've found a way to be very poor and kind of have fun with it, but man,
Right.
that's I have boat privilege.
Right,
okay?
right.
Like, again, just making the case, just getting so much of like our politics and the resurgent left is just about
Right.
like getting policies out there. Like
Right.
when people hear this shit, they fucking like it.
Right.
But again, because he can't imagine this, he makes
Right.
the case for it here. He just like gets it on people's minds.
Right.
Using homelessness as a symbol of capitalism's moral failure, in scare quotes, the socialists hope to build support for their agenda of rent control, public housing, unpopular things like that. Oh, and also minimum wage hikes and punitive corporate taxation.
I mean, he does do a very, very good job of making our case
Yeah.
in pretty eloquent terms. I mean, I wonder if the thing to do is to actually have Seattle DSA send Rufo an invitation, because he seems to be quite the propagandist.
I know.
For the socialist
could he
position.
be some kind of double agent, like a red herring for the left? Like, in that case, he should probably run. Maybe we can convince him to get back in it. One might dismiss, this is really offensive, one might dismiss Sawant as cartoonish.
Well, one might. One can also be
you
a
have
chode.
just now. You can. One might dismiss you as a major asshole, but she has been remarkably successful in stoking resentment against Amazon tech bros. I think that's a simplification, but I'm okay with it. And building public support for pushing the billionaire class, in scare quotes, with new taxes. And it sounds like he's congratulating her, I guess?
Right. Well, the billionaire class, I don't understand why we're putting that in quotation marks. I mean, there are a class of billionaires. They do, in fact, have $1 billion. They do act with class consciousness. So,
like most Americans, he's class blind.
Right.
All right? I mean,
he doesn't see color either, is what I heard.
Yeah. You want to talk about class consciousness? He's basically congratulating Sawant on promoting class consciousness
right.
among the working class in Seattle.
God.
Like, I mean, good. Like, thank you, is what she should say to him for this.
Where does he land with this? How does he have
God, it's so long, we'll never get through it. But so let's see. Like, so he talks about like the four sort of ideological positions. And we've mostly been reading his takedown of the socialists, but so it's like he identifies this sort of four-legged stool of Seattle politics as socialists, the compassion brigades. It's like it's a right-wing trope to like deride human compassion.
Exactly.
But, I mean, I think it's losing its fucking purchase if it ever had any. Like,
Right.
I mean, just think about what you're saying, dude. The homeless industrial complex, which he goes on to talk about. Oh, and God, it's so enervating. Like, that one of the drivers of the spending are these nonprofits that help, that work to house people or support people in all the ways that they do, as if they're motivated by getting those grants.
Exactly.
To do that, which is like, I mean,
you got it kind of backwards, buddy.
It doesn't even make sense. And he really, actually, I'm going to find this where he talks about this. Oh, but the fourth one is, and addiction evangelists, which he sets up, like, in the 21st century, there are no straw men left, because there's always someone. You can always cherry pick someone who's going to espouse whatever view and then massage that in wherever you want. So he's like, his fourth thing is the dumbest of all, is like people who are like actively civically engaged people promoting addiction. And okay, but I really do want to find this about what he says about the homelessness industrial complex.
Right.
God, he's so good. With more than $1 billion spent on homelessness in Seattle every year, not enough, one should keep in mind Vladimir Lenin's famous quotation, "Who stands to gain?" In the world of Seattle homelessness, the big winners, scare quotes, are social services providers like the Seattle Housing and Resource Effort, the Low Income Housing Institute, and the Downtown Emergency Service Center.
Right.
Which constitute what I call the city's homelessness industrial complex. For the executive leadership of these organizations, homelessness is a lucrative business. In a most recent federal findings, the executive director of LIHI, the Low Income Housing Institute, Sharon Lee, earned $187,209 in annual compensation, putting her in the top 3%. Notice this. We'll talk about that. Of income earners nationwide. In my estimation, the executive director of Downtown Emergency Service Center, Danny Malone, has received at least $2 million in total compensation during his, he admits here, extended career in the misery business. So, like, just to break down his numbers there for a minute, like, he says in the top 3, making $187,000 puts you in the top 3%.
Right.
If you know what the graph of American income looks like,
right.
you know that the, like, hockey stick portion starts after that.
Right.
And it's at the 1%. It's
exactly,
like, because, like, actual, like, corporate executives make multi-millions of dollars a year in compensation alone, to say nothing of capital gains.
Right.
This is an old fucking trope about government employees, union employees,
right.
about as incomes fall generally, lashing out at people who make a decent living because of whatever institutional power they have,
right.
as if that's not fair. Instead of saying, well, everyone should be making $187,000 a year, because that's what the fuck it would cost to, like, say, actually have, like, a dignified life and a family.
Right.
Where if you chose, like, only one person worked,
right.
you know, and you raised kids, like, that's actually not that fucking much money in this town.
Right.
I mean, that's, like, a decent human life.
Right.
Like, what does he expect? But he also wants, like, God, no, you know he makes more than that, right? But he wants, if you're working in any kind of service to the community,
right,
part of that is that you should be sacrificing your own personal well-being to do that.
Exactly.
Like, that's the only legitimate way to do that. So he quotes someone who says, you know, who's talking about how the goal of these organizations is to keep collecting grants and federal matching funds, and it's like, well, okay,
that's kind of how it goes.
They're if you're trying to, they're charities, like, trying to do work. Okay, I'm not sure what you're saying.
Right.
And ends with this great quote: "It's more important to keep the staff paid than to actually help the poor become self-sufficient." And it's like, again, like, take a fucking step back for a minute. Like, people need to make a fucking living.
Right.
Like, in a just society, everyone would. And asking people who are helping their community to, like, for that to be a sacrifice, like, I don't know. It just fucking drives me nuts.
It's absurd. Let's see the conclusion. I'm curious about how he gets this all tied up in the end here.
Near the end, he says, "The best way to prevent homelessness isn't to build new apartment complexes or pass new tax levies, but to rebuild the family, community, and social bonds that once held communities together."
Well,
where would you like to start?
Time moves on. I think that's what a lot of conservatives of various stripes have a hard time understanding. And it's not just Christopher Rufo. In our race in the District 4 contest, my opponent, Alex Peterson, had earlier on in the year posted an article that had the headline, "Make Seattle Great Again." And that gives you a really good sense of sort of where a lot of these people are coming from, in the sense that populations like millennials, like people of color, like people who rent and don't aspire to say nothing of have the ability to actually attain that picket fence lifestyle, represent the fact that time moves forward, the country moves forward, that the city is facing challenges and problems in 2019 that are not the same ones as the ones that we had in 1959. And there's a real nostalgia that I think underwrites a lot of this worldview that Rufo is espousing here, and that they're having a hard time just coming to grips with the fact that it's not the same country that they had been promised, as very entitled folks who have the expectation that subaltern populations are always, and marginalized populations are always going to be sort of in a position of social subservience, they're having to deal with and contend with the fact that the winds of time are sort of blowing and leaving them behind. So it's exciting times, and I think that it's going to be up to us as organizers and as true progressives, as lefties, to make sure that these folks go the way of the dinosaurs and the dodo birds of politics, and that there's a new sort of sense of actual vibrancy, not just buzzword meaningless vibrancy and progressiveness and in city politics moving forward.
Vibrations that like everyone in the city can feel.
Exactly.
You know?
Right.
I think it also goes to like this, like I think a standard sort of pillar of conservative worldview and ideology, which is that the root of the structure and of the reality of people's lives, it all comes from culture. It's all about your cultural choices.
Right.
They want to individualize it and make it about the choices you make in life, and they want to make the primary focus of those choices is always culture. And that's why it comes back to this family stuff. No one's against families per se.
Exactly.
Right? Like, but they don't want to, but they want to say that culture comes first. And you see this in every argument about, certainly anytime relating to populations in poverty. It's everything from like pull up your pants to like and like rap music to like all these things, and then that JD Vance, right? Hillbilly Elegy, right? Like that's the white version. It's like it's all about, it's because culture has degraded.
Right.
And these people continue to make these bad cultural choices.
Right.
It's important to understand a quintessential pillar of conservative worldview, but it's also one that for the last 35 years has been adopted by neoliberal Democrats.
Right, very true. I mean, I think about, I believe it was Senator Patrick Moynihan in the late 1960s, I think it was 1968, who had written the commission on the crisis of the black family, sort of ascribing a lot of the social ills that existed in major cities in the aftermath of the high water marks of the civil rights movement, saying that the reason why those social ills existed was not because of the tremendous socioeconomic odds that black families were facing, but because of an intrinsic deficit in black families where, you know, black women were the ones who were stewarding families as opposed to black men taking the rightfully assumed breadwinner leadership role that had guided American economic policy for the previous, at that point, 30 years. And so Moynihan's logic, I think you're right to say, has proven remarkably tenacious, not just among conservatives, but also among a lot of liberals and progressives, even, who assume that, you know, the problem with many populations that are, you know, struggling with being priced out of their neighborhoods, that are seeing an achievement gap in American schools, has to do with intrinsic deficits to them. And, you know, it's also, in addition to being bogus and disingenuous, I think it's also just factually not true, right? Like, I think about the fact that...
Right, no, it's horseshit.
Here's, you know, a guy like Jay-Z, whose primary motivation in life for many decades was the acquisition of capital and wanting to marry an attractive, socially valued woman who's a high achiever and accumulate $1 billion. That sounds like the Republican dream to me.
Yeah.
Right? And in any other context, somebody like him would be celebrated as in fact, he is celebrated as an entrepreneur, celebrated as all of these things that sort of uphold this neoliberal logic, but it goes to show that the problem is not necessarily with the culture, because culture is as susceptible and malleable among black people as it is among anybody else, and we actually see some pretty right-leaning factions in African American culture that serve to prop up and apologize for capital. And so it shows you that the argument is disingenuous, because the problem all along, much like with the eyesore thing we were talking about earlier, has always been the people. It's never about any of these sort of peripheral concerns.
It's the talking about it in these moral terms, these moral individualized terms, is a veil over not wanting to talk about the structural morality, our morality as people, you know, on a larger level, because that would mean making real changes. When you can just blame people, and this is an old thing. I mean, this goes back. This is like a very Victorian like attitude, like the poor because they're degenerates. That's, you know. not to endorse outright the like normative nuclear family or anything, but if people weren't struggling so much, if communities hadn't been broken apart by capitalism, if people weren't dislocated, again, in the same piece, he's arguing, this asshole is arguing that people who can't pay their rent should just scatter off into the wind.
Exactly.
And then he's saying, but it's really because these degenerate slobs don't keep their families together.
Exactly.
Right?
Right.
It's like those two things are totally contradictory. If you want to promote family and community, your enemy is fucking capitalism.
Exactly.
And I'm not interested in promoting exclusively a like I said, normative nuclear family.
Right.
But some people want that or might choose that if they weren't just beaten into the ground and dislocated and atomized constantly.
Right. Exactly.
I mean, what causes the most friction in marriage? I mean, it's fucking money.
Economic stressors. Very true.
So, anyway, this guy is full of shit, but it's really been fun.
Right.
I hope he does get back into the race, but I'm more excited about your candidacy, and we're going to be we're going to be following that very closely. Well, I think that's a lot of content for this week. Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Shaun
much
Scott,
for
coming
me on.
We're going to link to all of the relevant, all these pieces, and to your website, because we want people to be able to get involved as well.
Right. So have everybody sign up to Scott2019.com. Check us out on Twitter too. We're at Elect Scott 2019 on Facebook under the name Shaun Scott for District 4. And if you live in the U District, you live in Eastlake, Ravenna, Wallingford, we're going to be coming to check you out. Laurelhurst, Sandpoint, View Ridge too. We'll see you guys on the streets coming up here. Our canvassing operation is getting ready to sort of start to launch, so we look forward to getting out and talking to people.
That's awesome. And folks can donate to you too through your website?
Sure can. You absolutely can.
All right. Well, we'll put a link to that as well.
And I'm sure we'll be talking about this over the next 10 months. Yeah. 10 months from today, I think, actually, is the election.
True.
We'll be pushing this campaign that whole time.
We need a big flag with your face on it that we can.
I've got one right here that you can actually.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, y'all. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.